The Mississippi heat hung thick as molasses over the Hathaway plantation in the summer of 1873, 8 years after the war that had torn the South asunder. The grand white columns of the main house still stood proud, but the paint had begun to peel, and the gardens that once bloomed with the labor of dozens now struggled with the care of just a few paid hands. The world had changed, but in Magnolia County, change came slowly, reluctantly, like blood from a stone. Ruby Washington stood at the edge of the cotton fields, her dark eyes surveying the land she had once worked as property. Now, 28, she carried herself with a dignity that had been forged in the fires of bondage and tempered by the hard-won freedom that followed. Her calloused hands, once forced to pick cotton until they bled, now worked by choice. Though choice, she had learned, was a luxury even freedom couldn't always afford. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path made her turn. Evelyn Hathaway emerged from the shade of the oak trees, her pale blue dress a stark contrast against the verdant backdrop. At 32, Evelyn bore the weight of widowhood and the burden of a plantation that struggled to survive in the New World Order. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but wisps had escaped in the humidity, softening her angular features. "Ruby," Evelyn's voice carried a tremor she tried to suppress. "I've been looking for you." The two women stood facing each other, the invisible lines of their past relationship, mistress and slave, still etched in the air between them. Though those lines had begun to blur in ways that terrified them both, Ruby had stayed on after emancipation, one of the few who had chosen to remain, drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. "Mrs. Hathaway," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "The cotton's coming in well this season, better than expected." Evelyn nodded, but her gaze lingered on Ruby's face with an intensity that made the air between them crackle with unspoken tension. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't quite a request. They moved together along the path that wound through the property, past the slave quarters that now stood empty, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. The weight of history pressed down upon them with each step, the ghosts of the past whispering warnings they chose not to hear. "The Reconstruction officials came by again yesterday," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're asking questions about the workers, about wages, about other things." Ruby felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. What kind of other things? Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face her, and in that moment, Ruby saw something in the white woman's eyes that made her breath catch. A vulnerability, a longing that mirrored her own forbidden feelings. "About us," Evelyn whispered. "About why you stayed. About why I—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a loaded gun. For months they had danced around it, their interactions charged with an electricity that neither could deny. Stolen glances across the dinner table, where Ruby now sat as a paid employee rather than a servant. Accidental touches when their hands brushed over ledger books. Conversations that lasted long into the night, filled with an intimacy that transcended their complicated history. "Evelyn," Ruby said, using her first name for the first time, and the sound of it on her lips was like a prayer and a curse combined. The older woman's composure cracked and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I know it's wrong. I know what people would say, what they would do to us both. But I can't stop feeling." Ruby stepped closer. Close enough to smell the lavender water Evelyn wore, close enough to see the freckles that dotted her pale skin. "You think I don't know wrong?" Ruby's voice was fierce, passionate. "I've lived wrong my whole life, been told I was wrong for wanting to read, wrong for wanting freedom, wrong for believing I was human. But this," she gestured between them, "this doesn't feel wrong. This feels like the first right thing in a world gone mad." The sound of horses approaching made them spring apart, their hearts hammering as they struggled to compose themselves. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. local men Ruby recognized as part of the group that had been making trouble for the freed slaves in the area. Their leader, a thin man named Jeremiah Colt, had been overseer on a neighboring plantation before the war and had never accepted the new order. "Mrs. Hathaway," Colt called out, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Fine evening for a walk." "Mr. Colt," Evelyn replied, her voice steady, despite the fear Ruby could see in her eyes. "What brings you to my property?" Colt's gaze shifted to Ruby, and his expression hardened. "Just checking on our neighbors, making sure everyone's adjusting properly to the new arrangements." His emphasis on the word arrangements carried a clear threat. "Everything is quite in order here," Evelyn said firmly. "Ruby is one of my most trusted employees." "Employee," Colt repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Funny how some folks have trouble remembering their place, even after all this time." Ruby felt her hands clench into fists, but she forced herself to remain silent. She had learned the hard way that confronting men like Colt directly only led to violence. "I think it's time for you to leave my property," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of plantation owners. Colt smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression. "Of course, Mrs. Hathaway, but you might want to be careful about the company you keep. People are talking, and in times like these, reputation is everything." With that ominous warning, he and his companions rode away, leaving Ruby and Evelyn standing in the gathering dusk, both understanding that their secret was no longer as secret as they had hoped. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Evelyn turned to Ruby, her face pale but determined. "They know," she whispered. "They suspect," Ruby corrected. "But suspicion isn't proof. In Mississippi in 1873, suspicion is enough to get us both killed." Ruby reached out and took Evelyn's hand, their fingers intertwining despite the danger. "Then we'll have to be very careful," she said. "Because I'm not giving this up. I'm not giving you up." The first chapter of their dangerous love story had begun, and already the shadows were gathering around them, threatening to destroy everything they dared to hope for. 3 weeks had passed since Colt's threatening visit, and the tension in Magnolia County had grown thick as the humidity that clung to everything like a second skin. Ruby found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, aware that eyes were watching, tongues were wagging, and danger lurked in every shadow. The Hathaway plantation had become both sanctuary and prison. During the day, Ruby maintained the careful facade of employee and employer, but as evening fell and the other workers departed for their homes in town, the mask could finally slip away. It was on such an evening that Ruby found herself in the main house's library, a room that had once been forbidden to her, but now served as their secret meeting place. The leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling had been her gateway to literacy. Evelyn had taught her to read in secret during the war, a crime that could have cost them both dearly even then. Evelyn entered quietly, carrying a tea service that trembled slightly in her hands. The strain of their situation was taking its toll. She had grown thinner, her cheekbones more pronounced, her eyes shadowed with worry and sleepless nights. "The Reconstruction officials came again today," Evelyn said, setting down the tray with careful precision. "They're asking more pointed questions about our arrangement." Ruby looked up from the ledger she had been reviewing. She now managed much of the plantation's bookkeeping, her sharp mind for numbers proving invaluable to keeping the struggling estate afloat. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, as far as it goes. That you're an employee, that you handle the accounts, that your work has been exemplary." Evelyn poured the tea with steady hands, but Ruby noticed the slight tremor in her voice. "But they're not satisfied with simple answers anymore." Ruby rose from her chair and moved to the window, peering through the heavy curtains at the darkening landscape. In the distance, she could see lights flickering in the windows of neighboring plantations, and she wondered how many of those homes harbored secrets as dangerous as theirs. "There's something else," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I received a letter today from my sister in Charleston. Ruby turned, sensing the gravity in Evelyn's tone. Evelyn's sister, Margaret, had married into Charleston society and had always looked down on what she considered Evelyn's eccentric ways, her education of slaves, her relatively lenient treatment of workers, her failure to remarry quickly after her husband's death. "She's heard rumors," Evelyn said, her hands clasping and unclasping nervously, "about us, about our relationship. She's threatening to come for a visit to assess the situation herself." The implications hit Ruby like a physical blow. Margaret's visit would mean scrutiny they couldn't afford, questions they couldn't answer, and the very real possibility of exposure that could destroy them both. "When?" Ruby asked. "Within the month." Ruby moved away from the window and sat beside Evelyn on the small sofa, close enough that their knees touched through the fabric of their skirts. The contact sent electricity through both women, a reminder of the passion that burned beneath their careful restraint. "We could leave," Ruby said quietly. "Go north, where things are different." Evelyn's laugh was bitter. Different, perhaps, but not accepting. A white woman and a black woman together? Even in Boston or New York, we would be outcasts, curiosities at best, targets at worst. "Then what do you suggest?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a determination that both thrilled and terrified Ruby. "I've been thinking about something that might protect us both, legally speaking." Ruby waited, sensing that whatever Evelyn was about to propose would change everything between them. "Marriage," Evelyn said simply. The word hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Ruby felt her heart stop, then begin racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. "Marriage," Ruby repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Think about it," Evelyn said, turning to face her fully. "As my wife, you would have legal protections, property rights, the right to inherit, and while people might whisper and speculate, they couldn't touch us legally." "Evelyn," Ruby said slowly, "marriage between the races is illegal in Mississippi, has been since before the war." "But not everywhere," Evelyn replied, her eyes bright with possibility. "There are places, territories, states where such laws don't exist or aren't enforced. We could travel, find a minister willing to perform the ceremony, and return as a married couple." Ruby felt her world tilting on its axis. The idea was audacious, dangerous, and completely impossible. It was also the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "You're talking about risking everything," Ruby said. "Your reputation, your property, your life. For me." Evelyn reached out and took Ruby's hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. "Ruby, you are everything. You're the reason I wake up each morning, the reason I found the strength to rebuild this place, the reason I believe in tomorrow. Without you, I have nothing worth protecting." Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks as the full weight of Evelyn's words hit her. In a world that had told her she was worth nothing, here was a woman willing to sacrifice everything for their love. "The risks," Ruby began, "are worth taking," Evelyn finished firmly. "I've lived my whole life doing what was expected, what was proper, what was safe. I married the man my father chose, ran this plantation the way society demanded, played the role of the grieving widow with appropriate dignity. But with you, I'm alive. With you, I'm myself." Ruby leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of all the love she had been holding back. When they broke apart, both women were crying. "Yes," Ruby whispered, "yes, I'll marry you." But even as they held each other in the firelight, both women knew that their declaration of love was also a declaration of war against a society that would stop at nothing to destroy them. Outside, unbeknownst to them, a figure moved away from the library window, having seen and heard enough to confirm the worst suspicions. Jeremiah Colt smiled grimly as he mounted his horse and rode into the night, already planning how to use this information to his advantage. The lovers had made their choice, but they were no longer alone in their secret. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plantation grounds as Ruby made her way to the main house, her mind still reeling from the previous night's conversation. The word marriage echoed in her thoughts like a bell that couldn't be unrung, filling her with equal measures of joy and terror. She found Evelyn in the morning room, staring out at the gardens with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The older woman's face was pale, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she had slept as little as Ruby. "Second thoughts?" Ruby asked quietly, settling into the chair across from her. Evelyn turned, and Ruby saw a flicker of fear in her green eyes before it was replaced by steely determination. "Every minute since I said it," Evelyn admitted, "but not about wanting to marry you, about whether we can survive what comes after." Before Ruby could respond, the sound of approaching carriages interrupted them. Through the window, they could see a small procession making its way up the drive. 2 carriages and several riders, all bearing the unmistakable air of official business. "The Reconstruction officials," Evelyn breathed, rising quickly. "They're early." Ruby felt her stomach drop. "How many?" "Too many." Evelyn moved to the window for a better look. "And they've brought the sheriff." The implications were clear. This wasn't a routine visit about labor practices or tax assessments. This was an investigation. "Ruby, you need to go," Evelyn said urgently. "Use the back stairs. Go to your quarters and stay there until they leave." But Ruby shook her head firmly. "No, if they're here about us, running will only make things worse. We face this together." Evelyn looked as though she wanted to argue, but the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch cut short any debate. A moment later, the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to work for the Hathaways after her husband died building the railroad, appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hathaway," she said in her careful English, "there are men here to see you. They say it's official business." "Show them to the parlor," Evelyn instructed, her voice steady, despite the fear Ruby could see in her eyes. "And Mrs. Chen, please ask them to wait a moment while I make myself presentable." As soon as the housekeeper left, Evelyn turned to Ruby. "Whatever happens, whatever they ask, we stick to our story. You're my employee, nothing more." Ruby nodded, though they both knew that their carefully constructed facade might not be enough to protect them from whatever storm was brewing. They made their way to the parlor, where 5 men waited with the uncomfortable air of those who brought unwelcome news. Ruby recognized Sheriff Morrison, a heavy-set man who had been notably absent during the worst of the post-war violence against freed slaves. Beside him stood 2 men in the dark suits of federal officials, and behind them, like a spider in the corner of its web, lurked Jeremiah Colt. "Mrs. Hathaway," Sheriff Morrison began, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Thank you for seeing us. I believe you know Mr. Colt, and these gentlemen are federal agents Harrison and Webb." Evelyn inclined her head graciously, every inch the plantation mistress despite the circumstances. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe this visit?" Agent Harrison, a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Hathaway, we've received reports of irregularities in your household arrangements, specifically regarding your relationship with this woman." He gestured toward Ruby with barely concealed distaste. "Ruby Washington is my bookkeeper and household manager," Evelyn replied smoothly. "She's been invaluable in helping me maintain the plantation during these difficult times." "Is that all she is?" Agent Webb asked, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. He was younger than his partner, with the eager cruelty of a man looking to make his reputation. Ruby felt her hands clench at her sides, but she forced herself to remain silent. Speaking out of turn would only confirm their suspicions. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Evelyn said, though her voice had taken on a dangerous edge. Colt stepped forward then, his smile predatory. "Mrs. Hathaway, there's no need for pretense. I've seen you two together. The way you look at each other, the way you touch, it's unnatural." The word hung in the air like a curse, and Ruby felt something cold and sharp twist in her stomach. She had heard that word applied to herself many times, Unnatural for a slave to want to read. Unnatural for a black woman to think herself equal to whites. Unnatural for someone like her to dare to love someone like Evelyn. "Mr. Colt," Evelyn said, her voice ice cold, "I think you should be very careful about the accusations you make in my home." But Sheriff Morrison was already moving, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Mrs. Hathaway, I'm afraid we're going to need to search the premises, and we'll need to question both you and Miss Washington separately." "On what grounds?" Evelyn demanded. Agent Harrison produced a folded document from his coat. "On the grounds of suspected violation of moral decency laws, potential fraud regarding labor arrangements, and—" he paused dramatically, "suspicion of illegal cohabitation." Ruby felt the world tilt around her. Illegal cohabitation was a charge that could result in imprisonment, fines, and complete social destruction. For a black woman and a white woman, the penalties would be even more severe. "This is preposterous," Evelyn said, but Ruby could hear the fear creeping into her voice. "Is it?" Webb asked. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around, starting with the sleeping arrangements." The next hour passed in a blur of humiliation and terror. The officials searched the house from top to bottom, examining bedrooms, looking for evidence of shared quarters, questioning the few remaining servants about what they had seen and heard. Ruby was forced to stand silently while they rifled through her personal belongings, looking for letters, gifts, anything that might prove an inappropriate relationship. They found nothing concrete. Ruby and Evelyn had been careful to maintain separate bedrooms to avoid leaving written evidence of their feelings. But Ruby could see in the officials' faces that absence of proof was not the same as proof of absence. Finally, they gathered again in the parlor, where Agent Harrison delivered their verdict with the satisfaction of a man who had accomplished his mission. "Mrs. Hathaway, while we haven't found definitive proof of wrongdoing, the atmosphere in this household is concerning. We'll be conducting regular inspections going forward, and any hint of impropriety will result in immediate legal action." He turned to Ruby, his expression hardening further. "As for you, Miss Washington, I suggest you find employment elsewhere, quickly." "Ruby Washington is a valued employee," Evelyn said firmly. "She will remain in my employ as long as I see fit." "That," Sheriff Morrison said, "may not be your decision to make much longer." As the officials prepared to leave, Colt lingered behind, approaching Evelyn with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. "Mrs. Hathaway," he said quietly, "this doesn't have to be difficult. There are people in this county who would be very interested in purchasing your property. Good people who understand the proper order of things. You could relocate somewhere more, suitable to your particular inclinations." "Get out of my house," Evelyn said, her voice deadly quiet. Colt smiled and tipped his hat. "Think about it, Mrs. Hathaway, because this is just the beginning." As the carriages rolled away, Ruby and Evelyn stood in the parlor, both understanding that their world had fundamentally changed. They were no longer secret lovers stealing moments of happiness. They were marked women, targets in a war they hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. "What do we do now?" Ruby asked. Evelyn moved to the window, watching the dust settle on the drive where their tormentors had departed. When she turned back, her face was set with grim determination. "Now," she said, "we get married, before they can stop us." The decision to marry had transformed from a romantic dream into a desperate necessity overnight. As Ruby sat in the plantation's small chapel the morning after the officials' visit, she felt the weight of their situation pressing down like a physical force. The chapel, built by Evelyn's grandfather, had once been a symbol of the family's piety and social standing. Now, it felt like a sanctuary under siege. Evelyn entered quietly, carrying a leather satchel and wearing a traveling dress of deep blue wool. Her face was pale but determined, and Ruby could see the sleepless night etched in the lines around her eyes. "I've been making arrangements," Evelyn said without preamble, settling beside Ruby on the worn wooden pew. There's a minister in Kansas Territory, a man named Reverend Samuel Clark, who's known for his progressive views on social justice. He's performed marriages that other ministers wouldn't touch. Ruby felt her heart skip. Kansas Territory is over 500 miles away. I know. The journey will take at least a week each way, possibly more depending on weather and road conditions. Evelyn opened the satchel and withdrew a small stack of papers. I've arranged for a wagon and supplies. We'll travel as employer and employee. You're accompanying me on business to settle some property matters. Ruby examined the documents Evelyn had prepared. They were expertly forged travel papers, letters of introduction, and even a fictional property deed that would explain their presence in Kansas. The attention to detail was remarkable, but it also drove home the magnitude of what they were attempting. Evelyn, Ruby said carefully, once we do this, there's no going back. Even if we keep it secret, even if no one ever finds out, we'll be married, legally, spiritually, completely. Evelyn turned to face her fully, and Ruby saw tears glistening in her green eyes. Ruby, I've been thinking about that all night, about what it means, what we're risking, what we might lose. She reached out and took Ruby's hands in hers. But I've also been thinking about what we'll gain. The right to call each other wife, the legal protections, however limited they might be. The knowledge that in the eyes of God and the law, we belong to each other. Ruby felt her own tears beginning to fall. And if we're caught, if someone discovers what we've done, then we'll face the consequences together, as married women should. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and both women tensed. Through the chapel's small windows, they could see Mrs. Chen hurrying toward them, her face creased with worry. Mrs. Hathaway, she called out as she reached the chapel door. There are riders coming, many riders. Ruby and Evelyn exchanged a look of alarm and quickly moved to the window. In the distance, they could see a group of at least a dozen men on horseback, moving with the purposeful stride of those who came bearing trouble. Colt, Evelyn breathed, recognizing the lead rider. But it's not just him, Ruby observed, her stomach sinking as she counted the figures. He's brought friends. They watched in growing dread as the riders approached the main house. These weren't officials or lawmen. They were local men, the kind who had formed vigilante groups throughout the South to enforce their own version of justice when the law proved insufficient to their needs. Mrs. Chen, Evelyn said urgently, go to the house and tell them I'm not receiving visitors today. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in. The older woman nodded and hurried away, but Ruby could see it was already too late. The riders had reached the house and were dismounting with the confidence of men who didn't intend to be turned away. We need to leave, Ruby said. Now, the wagon isn't ready. Then we take horses. Evelyn, if they catch us here, together, after yesterday's visit, Ruby didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what men like Colt were capable of when they felt their world order was threatened. Evelyn nodded grimly and gathered up the papers, stuffing them back into the satchel. The stable. We can take the back path through the woods. They slipped out of the chapel and made their way carefully toward the stables, using the outbuildings and trees for cover. Behind them, they could hear raised voices from the direction of the main house, Colt and his men demanding entry, Mrs. Chen's voice raised in protest. In the stable, they quickly saddled two of the strongest horses, their hands shaking with urgency and fear. Ruby had learned to ride during her years on the plantation, though she had never imagined she would be fleeing for her life on horseback. Where do we go? Ruby asked as they led the horses toward the back of the stable. North, Evelyn said. Toward Memphis first, then west to Kansas. We'll have to avoid the main roads, travel at night when possible. As they prepared to mount, the sound of splintering wood echoed across the plantation grounds. Colt and his men had forced their way into the main house. Mrs. Hathaway, Colt's voice carried clearly in the morning air. We know you're here. Come out and face what you've done. Ruby felt ice in her veins. What I've done, she whispered. Evelyn's face had gone white. They're not just here to intimidate us. They're here to... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Ruby understood. This wasn't about driving them apart or forcing them to conform. This was about punishment. They mounted quickly and spurred their horses toward the tree line, just as shouts erupted from the house. Someone had spotted them. There! They're running! The chase began immediately. Ruby could hear the thunder of hooves behind them as Colt and his men mounted up in pursuit. She leaned low over her horse's neck, urging the animal faster as they plunged into the woods. The forest provided some cover, but it also slowed their progress. Branches whipped at their faces and clothes as they navigated the narrow deer paths that wound through the Mississippi wilderness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. "This way!" Evelyn called, turning her horse toward a creek that ran through the property. "If we can reach the water, we might lose them." They splashed into the creek, the cold water shocking their horses and soaking their skirts. Ruby could hear their pursuers crashing through the underbrush behind them, getting closer with each passing moment. As they emerged from the creek on the far side, Ruby's horse stumbled on the muddy bank. For a terrifying moment, she thought she would be thrown, but she managed to keep her seat and urge the animal forward. "Ruby!" Evelyn called out, looking back with fear in her eyes. "I'm all right. Keep going." They broke free of the woods and found themselves on a dirt road that led north toward the county line. Their horses were tiring, but they pushed them harder, knowing that their lives depended on reaching safety. Behind them, Colt and his men emerged from the woods, their faces twisted with rage and determination. Ruby could see that they were gaining ground. "The county line!" Evelyn gasped, pointing ahead to where a wooden sign marked the boundary. "If we can reach it..." A gunshot cracked through the air, and Ruby felt the bullet whistle past her ear. They were close enough now that Colt was willing to risk shooting them down like animals. With a final, desperate effort, they spurred their exhausted horses across the county line just as another shot rang out. On the far side of the boundary, they could see a group of federal soldiers, a patrol that had been investigating reports of vigilante activity in the area. Colt and his men pulled up short at the county line, unwilling to pursue their quarry into federal jurisdiction. Ruby and Evelyn collapsed against their horses' necks, gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion and terror. They had escaped, but barely, and now they were truly fugitives, with no home to return to and no choice but to continue their desperate journey toward a marriage that might be their salvation or their doom. As they approached the federal soldiers, Ruby realized that their old life was over. Whatever lay ahead in Kansas territory, there would be no going back to the world they had known. They were committed now, for better or worse, to a path that would either lead to happiness or destruction. The point of no return had been crossed, and their fate was in the hands of God and a progressive minister they had never met, in a territory that might or might not accept what they dared to become. The federal patrol, led by Captain James Morrison, no relation to the local sheriff, provided Ruby and Evelyn with temporary sanctuary and an escort to the nearest railroad station. Captain Morrison, a weathered veteran of the Civil War, listened to their carefully edited account of being pursued by vigilantes with the weary understanding of a man who had seen too much of the South's resistance to change. "Ma'am," he told Evelyn as they prepared to board the northbound train, "I can't guarantee your safety if you return to Magnolia County. These vigilante groups are getting bolder, and the local authorities..." He shook his head grimly. "Well, let's just say they're not always inclined to protect folks who don't fit their idea of proper society." Ruby felt a chill at his words, understanding that their escape had been even more narrow than she had realized. As the train pulled away from the station, she watched the Mississippi countryside roll past the window and wondered if she would ever see it again. The journey to Kansas territory proved to be an education in the complexities of traveling as an interracial pair in 1873 America. Even in the supposedly more progressive North, they faced constant scrutiny, suspicious stares, and occasional outright hostility. They maintained their cover story of employer and employee, but Ruby could see the doubt in people's eyes, the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. In St. Louis, they were forced to find separate accommodations, Evelyn in a respectable hotel, Ruby in a boarding house that catered to black travelers. The separation was torture for both women, but they dared not risk exposure so close to their goal. It was during their second night in St. Louis that disaster nearly struck. Ruby was returning to her boarding house after a clandestine meeting with Evelyn when she noticed she was being followed. Two men in dark coats had been trailing her for several blocks, and when she turned down a side street, they quickened their pace. "Hey, girl," one of them called out. "You're that woman from Mississippi, aren't you? The one who's been causing trouble?" Ruby's blood turned to ice. Somehow, word of their flight had preceded them. She quickened her pace, but the men were faster, and soon they had cornered her in an alley between two warehouses. "Folks back home are real interested in talking to you," the second man said, his hand moving to his coat where Ruby could see the outline of a pistol. "And your lady friend, too." Ruby's mind raced. She was trapped, alone, and these men clearly intended to take her back to Mississippi, or worse. But as she prepared to fight for her life, a new voice cut through the darkness. "I believe the lady asked to be left alone." A tall figure emerged from the shadows, a black man in a minister's collar, carrying a walking stick and radiating an authority that made the two pursuers hesitate. "This ain't your business, preacher," the first man snarled. "Any threat to one of God's children is my business," the minister replied calmly, "and I should mention that I'm not alone." As if summoned by his words, several more figures emerged from the darkness, members of the local black community who had been alerted to the danger. The two would-be kidnappers found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "This ain't over," one of them muttered as they retreated, but Ruby could see they had lost their nerve. The minister approached her with gentle concern. "Are you hurt, sister?" "No," Ruby managed, though she was shaking. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if the Lord provides," the minister said simply. "I'm Reverend Joshua Williams, and unless I'm mistaken, you're the woman Reverend Clark has been expecting." Ruby stared at him in amazement. "You know about..." "Word travels fast among those of us who believe in justice," Reverend Williams explained. "Samuel Clark sent word that he might be performing a special ceremony soon and asked those of us along the route to keep watch for travelers who might need assistance." The relief Ruby felt was overwhelming. They weren't alone in this journey after all. There was a network of people, ministers, abolitionists, ordinary citizens who believed in equality, who were willing to help them reach their destination. Reverend Williams escorted Ruby safely back to her boarding house and arranged for additional protection for both women during the remainder of their stay in St. Louis. More importantly, he provided them with new travel documents and a letter of introduction that would smooth their path to Kansas territory. "Reverend Clark is a good man," he told them before they departed. "He's performed marriages for couples that other ministers wouldn't touch. Former slaves marrying their former master's children, mixed-race couples even." He paused meaningfully. "Well, let's just say he believes that love is love, regardless of what society might think." The final leg of their journey took them through the rolling plains of Kansas territory, where the endless sky seemed to promise new possibilities. As their stagecoach rolled toward the small town of Lawrence, Ruby felt a mixture of hope and terror that made her stomach churn. "What if he refuses?" she asked Evelyn during a quiet moment when their fellow passengers were dozing. "Then we'll find someone else," Evelyn replied firmly, "or we'll perform the ceremony ourselves, with God as our witness." Ruby smiled despite her fears. "I don't think that would be legally binding." "It would be binding to us," Evelyn said, taking her hand briefly before releasing it as one of the other passengers stirred. Lawrence, Kansas territory, proved to be a bustling frontier town, filled with the energy of people building something new. The streets were muddy and the buildings mostly wooden, but there was an optimism in the air that Ruby had never experienced in Mississippi. Reverend Samuel Clark's church was a modest wooden structure on the outskirts of town, but the man himself was anything but modest. Tall and imposing, with piercing blue eyes and prematurely grey hair, he radiated the kind of moral authority that came from a lifetime of fighting for justice. "Mrs. Hathaway, Miss Washington," he greeted them warmly. "Welcome to Kansas territory. I trust your journey was eventful." "That's one way to put it," Evelyn replied dryly. Reverend Clark's expression grew serious. "I've heard reports of trouble following you from Mississippi, men asking questions, offering rewards for information about your whereabouts." Ruby felt her heart sink. "They've tracked us here." "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time, which is why, if you're truly committed to this course of action, we should proceed immediately." He led them into his study, where he explained the legal complexities of what they were attempting. Kansas Territory had no specific laws prohibiting interracial marriage, but it also had no explicit protections for such unions. The ceremony would be legal in Kansas, but its recognition elsewhere would be questionable at best. "More importantly," he continued, "you need to understand that this marriage will make you targets for the rest of your lives. There will always be those who see your union as an abomination, a threat to the natural order. Are you prepared for that?" Ruby and Evelyn looked at each other, and in that moment all their fears and doubts crystallized into a single, clear truth. "Yes," they said in unison. Reverend Clark smiled. "Then let us begin." The wedding ceremony took place at dawn on a crisp October morning, with only Reverend Clark and his wife Martha as witnesses. The church was simple but beautiful in the early light, and Ruby felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since leaving Mississippi. She wore a dress of deep green silk that Evelyn had purchased for her in St. Louis. Not white, which would have been inappropriate for a woman of her race and station, but beautiful nonetheless. Evelyn wore a gown of cream-colored wool, elegant but understated, her auburn hair crowned with a simple wreath of wildflowers that Martha Clark had woven for the occasion. As they stood before the altar, hands clasped, Ruby felt the weight of history pressing down upon them. No two women like them had ever stood in this place. Speaking these vows, claiming this right, they were pioneers in the truest sense, venturing into uncharted territory with nothing but love to guide them. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Clark began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join these two souls in holy matrimony. Though the world may not understand or accept what we do here today, we know that love is the greatest commandment, and that God's love extends to all his children, regardless of race, station, or the prejudices of man." Ruby felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the familiar words took on new meaning. When Reverend Clark asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence that followed felt sacred, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Ruby Washington," Reverend Clark said, turning to her, "do you take Evelyn Hathaway to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Ruby said, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. "Evelyn Hathaway, do you take Ruby Washington to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Evelyn replied, her voice trembling with emotion. They had no rings. Such symbols would have been too dangerous to wear, but they clasped hands as Reverend Clark pronounced them married in the eyes of God and the law. When he told them they could kiss, Ruby felt the world shift around them, as if everything that had come before was merely preparation for this moment. The kiss was soft, sweet, and filled with all the love they had been forced to hide. When they broke apart, both women were crying, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of triumph over a world that had tried to keep them apart. "I present to you," Reverend Clark announced to his small congregation, "Mrs. Ruby and Mrs. Evelyn Hathaway Washington, The hyphenated name had been Evelyn's idea, a way to honor both their identities while creating something new together. It was unconventional, even radical, but then everything about their union challenged convention. After the ceremony, Martha Clark served them a simple wedding breakfast, and Reverend Clark presented them with a marriage certificate that would serve as legal proof of their union. The document was beautifully calligraphed, with official seals and signatures that made their marriage as legitimate as any other. "Guard this carefully," he advised. "It may be the only protection you have in the years to come." As they prepared to leave Lawrence, Reverend Clark pulled them aside for a final conversation. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that what you've done here today is more than just a personal commitment. You've struck a blow for equality, for the right of all people to love whom they choose. There will be others who follow in your footsteps, and they'll be able to do so because you had the courage to go first." Ruby felt the weight of that responsibility, but also its honor. They weren't just two women in love. They were pioneers, blazing a trail that others might one day follow. The journey back east was fraught with new dangers. As married women, they could no longer maintain the pretense of employer and employee, but neither could they openly acknowledge their relationship. They traveled as cousins, sharing rooms when possible and maintaining careful distance when in public. In Chicago, they received devastating news. A telegram from Mrs. Chen informed them that the Hathaway plantation had been burned to the ground by vigilantes and that warrants had been issued for their arrest on charges of fraud, moral turpitude, and violation of public decency laws. "We can't go back," Evelyn said, staring at the telegram with hollow eyes. "Ever." Ruby felt her heart break for her wife. The word still sent thrills through her, who had lost everything she had inherited from generations of her family. But she also felt a fierce determination to build something new together. "Then we go forward," Ruby said firmly. "We make a new life, somewhere we can be ourselves." They decided on Boston, where the abolitionist movement had created a more tolerant atmosphere, and where Evelyn's education and Ruby's business skills might allow them to support themselves. It wouldn't be easy. Even in Boston, their relationship would need to remain largely secret, but it offered the possibility of a life together. As their train pulled into Boston's South Station on a gray November morning, Ruby looked out at the bustling city and felt a mixture of fear and hope. They had lost everything they had known, but they had gained something precious: the right to call each other wife, the legal protections of marriage, and the knowledge that their love had been blessed by God and recognized by law. The hardest part of their journey was over, but Ruby knew that the real test was just beginning. Could two women from such different backgrounds, carrying such a scandalous secret, build a life together in a world that would never fully accept them? Only time would tell. But as Evelyn took her hand and squeezed it gently, Ruby felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were married now, bound together by vows that no earthly power could break, and that gave her strength to face an uncertain future. 6 months after their arrival in Boston, Ruby and Evelyn had managed to establish a precarious but sustainable life in the city's South End. They lived as cousins in a modest boarding house run by a progressive widow named Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, who asked few questions and seemed to understand more than she let on. Evelyn had found work as a governess for the children of wealthy families, her southern refinement and excellent education making her a desirable employee despite the whispered questions about her background. Ruby had established herself as a bookkeeper for several small businesses, her sharp mind for numbers and meticulous attention to detail earning her a reputation for reliability. But their carefully constructed new life was about to face its greatest test. It was a cold February morning when the knock came at their door. Ruby answered to find a well-dressed man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the calculating eyes of a professional investigator. "Miss Washington?" he inquired politely. "My name is Detective Harrison Blackwood. I wonder if I might have a word with you and Mrs. Hathaway." Ruby's blood turned to ice. She recognized the name. Blackwood was a private investigator known for tracking down fugitives and missing persons. Someone had hired him to find them. "I'm afraid Mrs. Hathaway is not available," Ruby said carefully, though her heart was pounding. "Oh, but I think she is," Blackwood replied with a thin smile. "You see, I've been watching this establishment for several days. I know she's here, and I know about your unusual living arrangement." Before Ruby could respond, Evelyn appeared behind her, having heard the conversation. Her face was pale but composed, and she carried herself with the dignity that had served her well throughout their ordeal. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, "I assume someone has paid you to find us." "Indeed they have," Blackwood confirmed. "Your sister, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore of Charleston, is quite concerned about your welfare. She's hired me to locate you and assess your situation." Ruby felt her stomach drop. Margaret Whitmore was Evelyn's younger sister, a woman who had always disapproved of Evelyn's progressive views and had married into one of Charleston's most conservative families. If she had hired a detective, it meant she suspected the truth about their relationship. "My sister has no legal authority over me," Evelyn said firmly. "I'm a grown woman, free to live where and how I choose." But that's where things become complicated," Blackwood replied, producing a folder from his coat. "You see, Mrs. Whitmore has petitioned the courts in South Carolina to have you declared mentally incompetent, based on reports of your erratic behavior and inappropriate associations." The words hit Ruby like physical blows. A declaration of mental incompetency would strip Evelyn of all her legal rights, making her a ward of her sister's family. It would also invalidate their marriage and leave Ruby completely vulnerable to prosecution. "That's preposterous," Evelyn said, but Ruby could hear the fear creeping into her voice. "Is it?" Blackwood asked. "A white woman of good family living in poverty, associating with Negroes, abandoning her proper place in society. Many would consider such behavior evidence of mental instability." Ruby stepped forward, her anger overriding her caution. "Mrs. Hathaway is one of the most intelligent, capable women I've ever known. The idea that she's mentally incompetent is absurd." Blackwood's smile turned predatory. "And what would you know about it, Miss Washington? What exactly is your relationship with Mrs. Hathaway that gives you such insight into her mental state?" The question hung in the air like a trap, and Ruby realized that anything she said could be used against them. If she claimed to be merely an employee, it would undermine her defense of Evelyn. If she revealed the truth about their relationship, it would provide the very evidence Margaret needed to destroy them both. "Ruby is my dearest friend," Evelyn said carefully. "She has been my companion and support through very difficult times." "Companion?" Blackwood repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, I've heard that term used to describe unusual friendships between women. Tell me, Mrs. Hathaway, do you and Miss Washington share living quarters?" "We share a boarding house," Evelyn replied, "as do many unmarried women in the city." "But you share a room, do you not? The same bed?" Ruby felt the walls closing in around them. Somehow, Blackwood had gathered detailed information about their living arrangements, possibly by bribing other residents of the boarding house or even Mrs. Thornton herself. "Our financial circumstances require us to economize," Evelyn said, but her voice was growing strained. "I see, and this economizing extends to other intimacies as well." The implication was clear, and Ruby saw red. "How dare you?" "Ruby, don't!" Evelyn said quickly, but it was too late. Blackwood's eyes lit up with triumph. "Ah, so protective of each other. How touching. Tell me, Miss Washington, what would you say if I told you that I have witnesses who observed you and Mrs. Hathaway in compromising positions, witnesses who would be willing to testify in court about the unnatural relationship between you?" Ruby felt the world spinning around her. They had been so careful, so discreet, but apparently not careful enough. In a city like Boston, where gossip traveled fast and money could buy testimony, their secret had been exposed. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore is prepared to be reasonable," Blackwood replied. "She understands that you may have been influenced by unsavory companions. If you return to Charleston voluntarily, submit to proper medical evaluation, and sever all contact with Miss Washington, she's willing to withdraw the competency petition." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid you'll both be arrested. Mrs. Hathaway on charges of moral turpitude and violation of public decency. Miss Washington on charges of corrupting a white woman and other offenses that carry very serious penalties." Ruby felt her knees go weak. The other offenses Blackwood referred to could include anything from fraud to assault, charges that could result in years in prison or worse. "I need time to consider," Evelyn said. "Of course. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. After that, I'll be forced to involve the local authorities." After Blackwood left, Ruby and Evelyn sat in their small room, holding each other and trying to process the magnitude of their situation. Everything they had built, everything they had fought for, was crumbling around them. "We could run again," Ruby said desperately. "Go west, to California or Oregon Territory." "With what money?" Evelyn asked. "And how long before they find us again? Margaret has resources we can't match, and now that they know what to look for..." Ruby knew she was right. They were trapped, caught between impossible choices that would destroy them no matter what they decided. "There is one option," Evelyn said quietly, "something I've been thinking about since Blackwood left." "What?" Evelyn pulled out the marriage certificate that Reverend Clark had given them, the document they had guarded so carefully throughout their journey. "We could make this public, announce our marriage, claim the legal protections it provides." Ruby stared at her in shock. "Evelyn, that would be suicide. The scandal alone would destroy us both." "Would it? Or would it force the issue into the open, where we might have a chance to fight?" Evelyn's eyes were bright with desperate hope. "Think about it, por favor. Continue girando a sua resposta. Expert logo Tizo 1 Ruby. If we're legally married, Margaret can't have me declared incompetent without also challenging the validity of our marriage. And if she does that, she'll have to do it in court, in public, where we can defend ourselves." Ruby felt her mind racing through the implications. "But the marriage was performed in Kansas territory. There's no guarantee it would be recognized here in Massachusetts." "No guarantee it wouldn't be either," Evelyn countered. "And even if the marriage itself is challenged, the publicity might work in our favor. There are people in Boston who support equality, who believe in justice. If we can make this a public issue rather than a private scandal..." "We could also end up in prison," Ruby pointed out, "or worse." "We're going to end up destroyed anyway if we do nothing," Evelyn said firmly. "At least this way, we go down fighting." Ruby looked at the marriage certificate, thinking of Reverend Clark's words about striking a blow for equality. Perhaps this was what he had meant. Not just the private act of getting married, but the public courage to defend that marriage against all who would challenge it. "If we do this," Ruby said slowly, "we need allies. People who will support us publicly, who will help us fight the legal battles that are coming." Evelyn nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. There's a lawyer here in Boston, a man named William Morris, who's been involved in civil rights cases. And there are ministers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates who might be willing to stand with us." "It's a terrible risk," Ruby said. "Everything we've done has been a terrible risk," Evelyn replied. "But we've come this far together. Are you willing to take one more chance?" Ruby thought about everything they had endured, the flight from Mississippi, the dangerous journey to Kansas, the months of hiding their true relationship. They had already sacrificed everything for their love. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding and start fighting. "Yes," she said finally, "let's do it." The next morning, they walked hand in hand to the offices of the Boston Herald, one of the city's most progressive newspapers. The editor, a man named Thomas Garrison, who had been a vocal supporter of abolition, listened to their story with growing amazement. "You're asking me to publish an account of your marriage," he said slowly. "A marriage between a white woman and a black woman, performed in Kansas territory. We're asking you to publish the truth," Evelyn said firmly, "and to help us defend our right to love whom we choose." Garrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the potential consequences. Finally, he smiled. "Mrs. Hathaway Washington, Mrs. Washington Hathaway, you've just given me the story of the century." The article appeared on the front page of the Herald the next day, under the headline, "Love Conquers All, the Remarkable Marriage That Challenges Society's Boundaries." It told their story with sympathy and respect, presenting them not as curiosities or deviants, but as two women whose love had triumphed over seemingly impossible obstacles. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some condemned them as abominations, threats to the natural order, but others, more than Ruby had dared hope, rallied to their defense. Ministers preached sermons about love and acceptance. Women's rights advocates held rallies supporting their right to marry. Legal scholars debated the validity of their union in newspapers and lecture halls across the city. When Detective Blackwood arrived that evening with a warrant for their arrest, he found them surrounded by supporters, including William Morris and two other prominent lawyers who had volunteered to represent them without charge. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood protested as photographers captured the scene for the next day's papers. "What's irregular," Morris replied calmly, "is attempting to arrest two legally married women for the crime of loving each other." The legal battle that followed would last for months, drawing national attention and forcing America to confront questions about love, marriage, and equality that it wasn't ready to answer. Ruby and Evelyn would face persecution, threats, and moments of despair that tested their resolve to its limits. But they would also discover that they were not alone. Across the country, other couples like them, hidden, frightened, but real, would find courage in their example. The love that had begun in the cotton fields of Mississippi would become a beacon of hope for all who dared to love outside society's narrow definitions. As Ruby stood in the courthouse on the day their case was finally heard, holding Evelyn's hand and facing a future that remained uncertain, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had lost everything they had once known, but they had gained something infinitely more precious, the right to love openly, to fight for their happiness, and to show the world that love, in all its forms, was worth defending. The judge's ruling would determine their immediate fate, but Ruby knew that regardless of the outcome, they had already won the most important victory. They had refused to let fear and hatred destroy their love, and in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would follow in their footsteps. The secret that had shocked Mississippi in 1873 was secret no more. It was a declaration of love that would echo through history, a testament to the power of two hearts that refused to be silenced, and a promise that love, true love, would always find a way to triumph over the forces that sought to destroy it. In the end, Ruby and Evelyn's marriage would be upheld by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in a landmark decision that recognized the validity of their Kansas Territory union. They would live together for another 43 years, becoming pillars of Boston's progressive community and inspiring generations of couples who dared to love beyond society's boundaries. Their story became legend, whispered in parlors and preached from pulpits, a reminder that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in the human experience. And though the world they lived in was often cruel and unforgiving, their love had proven that even the most impossible dreams could come true for those brave enough to fight for them. The slave who married her mistress had indeed shocked Mississippi in 1873, but more importantly, she had changed the world.